The sky over Qarth was a plate of beaten copper, bright and hard and without mercy. Heat pressed on the shoulders of men and beasts alike, stretching shadows into thin tatters beneath the pale gardens and tall towers of the greatest city that ever was or will be. Daenerys Targaryen moved under it like a small flame walking through a slow kiln, a girl at the head of a dwindled caravan, the last of a house long fallen. The perfumes of the city were honeyed and false. Sandalwood and crushed citron and rare summer blossoms floated down from balconies where silken sleeves fluttered like tongues. But beneath the sweetness was brine and rot, tar and old linen, the sour breath of a port that had traded in every sin long enough to forget they were sins. She had slept little. Her dreams were a muddle of wings and black doors, of blue lips parting to reveal teeth stained by 1,000 cups of shade of the evening. When she woke, she tasted resin and bitterness, and her heart smote the cage where the dragons slept. She had risen at dawn and gone to them as she always did, to whisper in Valyrian and let their warm breath ghost her palms and feel the thrum of a heartbeat that was hers and not hers. They were gone. At first her mind refused the thing it knew. The cages stood as the ironmonger had forged them, hinges pinned, latches closed. The curtains that hid them had been drawn back, and the cage doors hung open like mouths in a scream. The silk covers were on the floor, slashed to ribbons, threads of gold catching the noonish light. There was no blood. There was a scorched scent, but faint, as if a single match had burned and gone out. "Yora," she said, and her voice was a thin wire that quivered when plucked. "Ser-Jora." Her handmaids had found her before he did. Irri went to her knees, her face ashen beneath the olive, wailing in Dothraki until Daenerys caught her by the wrists and lifted her up. Doria was already speaking rapidly in the patter of Qarth, summoning the household guards Xaro, Zoe and Daxos had given them, telling them to close the doors, to bar the windows, to search the terraces and lanes. Jogo, who had been sleeping in his cups, tumbled in half-armed and half-awake, his braid lashing his shoulder like a whip he swore to use on the thieves. Daenerys stood amongst the torn silks and empty bars and had the soft, absurd thought that she ought to sweep. Yora came with the sleep thick in his beard and his sword strapped crooked at his hip. His eyes were old eyes, deep-set and sure, the eyes of a man who had counted up the cost of many mornings. He took the room in at a glance. "The doors closed," Dany said. "The windows barred as always. The guards Xaro's," said Doria. She touched her throat as if to remind herself she had one. "Men of the 13, they swear it. They have not left their posts." "Then they were let in," Yora said. He knelt and ran thick fingers along the iron. "No forcing, no peaks." "Magic?" Irri whispered, making the sign her mother had taught her, the one to keep the dead from returning. "The Warlocks." Dany felt the name like cold water poured down her spine. The House of the Undying with its pale tower like a dead finger stabbed at the sky. 𝒑𝒂𝒕 with his blue mouth and blue nails and whispering voice that threaded itself through all the other voices in a hall that had no walls and too many doors. He had told her, smiling through indigo teeth, that Qarth desired her, that Qarth would honor her, that the 13 were many in fortune and one in heart, that the pureborn longed to lay their ancient city at the feet of a true queen. He had told her to come and see wonders. "Send for Xaro," she said. "He calls himself my host and my friend." Jogo did not wait for permission. He ran, his braid a banner. Dany stood, still in her linen shift, still smelling the faint smoke that was not smoke. She went to the balcony and looked down into Xaro's courtyard garden. All white stone and shade trees and a single clear pool that held the torn blue sky like a promise. Qarth moved beyond the walls in silks of celadon green and sea blue and whorled violet, its citizens with their painted eyes and bells on their shoes drifting like butterflies in a hothouse. A boy sang in a tongue she could not name while balancing cups on his forehead. A woman with a tattoo of a dolphin swam languid circles in a tub set with pearl. No one looked up. No one ever looked up in Qarth unless there was gold above them. Qarth came out of the shadows at her left elbow as if she had been there the whole time. The lacquered mask hid her face. It gleamed red as blood in a bowl. "You were warned," she said, gently as falling ash. I was told many things, Dany said, not turning. You spoke in riddles. To go north you must go south, �𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒄 said. To touch the light you must pass beneath the shadow. To take back what was yours you should not have come. Dany turned then. If you thought that, you might have said it before the doors were opened and my children stolen. They were not stolen. The masked woman's voice was soft as moth wings. They were taken where they belonged. The undying hunger. They were hungry long before you came. Then they shall starve, Dany said. The sound of her own voice steadied her. They will starve when Qarth burns. Be careful with your words. Your words bind you. The undying will not starve quickly. �𝒂𝒓 tilted her head so the mask caught the sun and threw it back in a bar of red across Dany's cheek. You must go. Go where? Jorah demanded behind her. We have no ships, no coin to speak of. No friends that will not melt in the sun if gold is held up to them. Go where the chain is forged, �𝒂𝒓 said. Then to where the chains are broken. You are flame made flesh, but it is not always dragons that light the fire. The things you lose are not always lost. The things you seek are not always found. Dany had no patience for glimmering words. She wanted iron and men with strong hands and a path that led to a door she could kick in. Are they in the house of the undying? �𝒂𝒓 did not answer. She did not need to. The heat crept down into Dany's bones. She stiffened. Then that is where I will go. Xaro came in on a swirl of perfume and a rustle of blue silk, rings dripping from every finger and his shaved scalp shining. He made a show of distress, pressing both hands to his chest so that all the jewels on it flashed. My sweet delight, he cried. My little silver queen, how cruelly the gods test us. Save your mourning for the warlocks, Jorah said. Set men to teach them a thing they had not been taught, how to break a line they were not ordered to break. Missandei taught them another, how to hear a call that did not come from a master. Dany taught them their names each morning over and over until they began to say them without asking. She had Jogo and Aggo drill the freedmen from the docks and the brickworks with clubs and spears and anything that would pass for such, and she bought rice with the last of her coin and fed every child who would come to her hands until their mothers began to cry because they had never seen hands so soft do anything so hard. Kraznys watched. He sent her invitations to share cooled wine in the evening, to watch the boys fight the dogs and the dogs fight each other. He sent old peaches in a cedar chest bound with brass, each peach wrapped in lamb's wool as if it were a treasure. They were the last of last season, and they bled a little at the stone when she ate them. She returned the chest with the stones inside. You cannot buy an army with stones, Jorah said. No, Dany said, licking the sweet from her thumb. But you can feed an army with peaches at least once. �𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒄, who would be her �𝒡𝒂𝒏𝒄𝒆 one day but was only a name murmured in the alleys now, sent to ask what she would pay for maps of the sewers. 𝒔𝒐𝒏𝒄𝒆 sent to ask if she liked perfumed oils and had any news of her cycles. The city pressed in. Dany felt it the way one feels a shirt that was once too big and had been washed too hot too often. It wanted to cling. On the 5th day, a boy came to her with his hands shaking beneath the weight of a water jar. He was a child of the gutters, all bones and scabs and eyes too large for his hungry face. Khaleesi, he said, for the docks had learned to call her that. They say if you go to the eastern gate at moonrise, you will see a thing that belongs to you. She went with Jorah and Missandei and a little knot of spears, and the moon was a hook that night, thin and bright. The eastern gate yawned to the desert, and beyond it the dunes lay like sleeping beasts. Something moved on the nearest of them. At first it was only a suggestion of movement, a trick of light and breeze. Then it resolved into men in cloaks with hoods drawn low. They carried something between them on poles. Khaleesi, Jorah said. I see it, she said, and the words scraped her throat as if she had swallowed sand. They set the litter down on the baked earth and drew back the cloth. Under it, lashed to the poles with silk cords as if silk could bind such a thing, lay a creature the size of a hound, its scales matte like char, its mouth slightly open to show the tiny razors of its teeth. The wings were cramped, the bones too new to bear too much. The eyes were open, and as she came closer she saw that they were a flat, dull blue, like water under a winter sky. It made a sound at the back of its throat, a thin, wet sound like a bubble that cannot rise. Daenerys' legs went soft. She went to her knees and pressed both palms to the dragon's chest. She could feel a heartbeat, slow and feeble as a moth's. It did not know her, or it did, and it hurt to know her. The cloaked men stood with their faces in shadow. One of them made a small, formal bow. "From the Undying," he said in accented Valyrian that ��𝒏𝒈 did not need to render. He meant to be understood. A gift for the Queen of Ashes. Jorah moved in a blur, and 2 men went down and a 3rd ran. The 4th laughed and drank something from a small vial and fell where he stood, mouth foaming. The dragon did not try to rise. Could not. She did not weep in front of the men. When she was alone, she put her forehead to the stone and let her breath go out in a long tide. She could taste the room as if it were a fruit, dust and old water and the shadow of oil. The dragon lay on the blanket near her feet. His breath scraped. Dany sang to it in a language the cradle had given her and called it all the names she had dreamed of and told it the story of its birth in the Red Land with the stars leaning close to listen. It did not sleep. It did not wake. He died at dawn, the heartbeat fluttering once and then not fluttering again. They burned him. Dany banked the coals herself and stood with the ash sifting over her sandals like snow while Iri made the sign again and murmured to ghosts. ��𝒏𝒈 set her small hand on Dany's arm and withdrew it, as if what she touched might consume her. They had tossed a spear into her camp and it had struck deep. That day she broke the last of the jewelry and bought oil. She bought casks and skins and pots and pans and sacks of grain and goats by the score. She bought the silence of 5 sailors and the brief service of 3 smugglers. And when Krasny sent to ask if she had reconsidered his pleasant offer to trade all the Unsullied for 1 dragon, she sent the messenger back with the dead thing's blue eye on a string and a word to give his master that needed no translating. They came for her at noon, when the brass of the city had its hottest shine. Their guards stepped aside because there were too many and because they wore the gold-threaded collars of men who never heard no. They took the whip of gold from Dany's hand, and they took her 56 and roared the order at them to cut their way through her like a plow through a field. 54 moved not at all. 2 shifted their spears and looked at her, not at the men who had never named them. Jorah knocked one good master down with the pommel of his sword and opened the throat of another and shouted to run. They did not run. The square was a baking pan. Men in armor were already coming at a trot, shields up. Dany could taste iron through the heat. Krasny himself stood on the steps of his pavilion with his hands on his hips and smiled. The boy who had once tried to remember his sister's face simply stood at the end of a row and watched the horizon. The thing she had spent days teaching the 56 to hear came into her mouth without her thinking. "Najat," she said in Valyrian, and then louder, "Najat." It was not a word the Unsullied had been taught. Not in this tone, not in this place. It meant something like forward and something like birth. One by one, as if the sound had a weight, spears tilted. The men who held them turned their heads as if their necks were stiff and something within them had begun to thaw. Krasny stopped smiling. "Forward," Dany said in their tongue. She did not have many words. She found the ones she had and used them up. "Forward. With me." She walked and they walked. The good masters shouted. A rank of city guards lowered pikes. Dany did not quicken her step. She could not feel her feet. She could feel the eyes on her, the cities and the gods. She said the word again, and this time Drogo took it in his mouth and hurled it the way a man hurls a stone. And Aggo did the same, and Jorah too with his cudgel voice, and ��𝒏𝒈 whispered it as if it were a prayer. "Najat." The pikes jutted toward her, 3 teeth in a monster's mouth. A spear shaft made a hollow thok sound on one of them. A second followed, and the third. The lines broke like bread. The 56 stepped through the crumbs. One of the Unsullied took a pike point in his ribs and did not stop until the man who held it was on his knees and spitting blood. The square became a thing made of time, each second stamped and laid over the last until they were 1 coin. It did not last long. Nothing that loud ever does. When at last her breath was tearing like silk in her throat, the good masters had fled to their towers. In the streets beyond, the low free men and the slaves and the women on the roofs had begun to shout a word she had not taught them. A word they had not needed a queen to teach them. Freedom! 𝒔𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒆𝒚 died with his hands on his hips and his smile still on his face. A kitchen boy named him to her afterward. The boy with his hair on end and his lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration. He said the good master had stood upon his pavilion and called them filth and told them to fall upon their swords at once and save him the trouble. One of the 56 had done as asked. He had fallen upon the good master's sword and driven it through his belly. The boy told it with the small, fierce joy of one who has seen a rule break and knows the world can never go back to the shape it was. They took 𝒂𝒐𝒏𝒈 not the way she dreamed of taking it, with banners and speeches and the world made simple. They took it hall by hall and square by square, with stones and buckets of oil, and by swapping the small songs men know for the small songs the unsullied had forgotten. Some of the good masters were killed. Some bought ships and flew. Some shaved and put on brown robes and called themselves priests of gods that were forgiving. The morning after, Dany sat in the hall of a villa that had been built around a pool and listened to 100 petitions, and the last two were a quarrel about a tiled roof and a girl brought with her mother to cry because she had no way to eat if she did not sell what men wanted to buy. "You cannot feed them all," Jorah said after, when she sat with her legs in the pool and cooled the fire in her muscles. "You cannot free them all." "No," she said, "but I can free her." �𝒐𝒖𝒓𝒏𝒆𝒚 came and knelt and named the dead to her in a quiet voice. She did not name her brother. That night Dany dreamt of the house of the undying again. She had not meant to. Dreams are not like ships. They come when they will. The tower was a bone with all the meat picked clean. Something had its mouth on it and was sucking at the marrow. She woke with her fists clenched and a child's cry in her ear that was not a child's. She turned her face into the pillows and bared her teeth like the dogs �𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒆𝒚 had loved. They did not stay long. You cannot hold a city you have not planned to hold without becoming the city. She could feel 𝒂𝒐𝒏𝒈 trying to climb into her and live there. Dany left a garrison of the 56, who were no longer 56 because death changes numbers, and a larger garrison of men who had decided they were men after all. She left �𝒪𝒃𝒃 to teach letters and counting to those who would come and to tell the city how to speak to itself. She left a water tax and a bread line and a rule that no one could be sold again. She left a promise that she would send grain when she had it and soldiers when she could spare them, and a word that if anyone said she had forgotten they were allowed to call her a liar for 3 days in the square without being punished. Then she went. The desert was the color of old bone. They crossed it on the backs of borrowed camels that stank and looked offended by everything. Dany kept her veil up against the wind and thought of the sea. Jorah watched the horizon and thought of something she did not ask him about. He was quiet too often, and she did not know what to do with a man who kept his own counsel except to ask him for it and be given the part he was willing to let her have. 𒒂𝒑𝒌𝒆𝒚 lay low and fat and dull in the sun, a loaf of bread that had been punched down and then forgotten. The sellswords who were paid to guard it came out to meet her, while the good masters stood behind the walls and counted their coin. The storm crows sent 3 men with bright cloaks. Prendyl na Ghezan with his oiled mustaches, Salor their Tyroshi captain who wore green and liked to be reminded of it, and a man whose cloak was blue on blue with a black tulip stitched at the corner. He had a smile that seemed to have happened to him rather than been made by him. "Dario Naharis," he said of himself, as if of someone he had met once and wanted to see again. "And you are a queen who travels light." "I prefer to move quickly," Dany said, "and my crown is in my blood." "Blood washes out," Prendyl said with a charming curl to his lip. "Not all blood," Dario murmured, still smiling. They made an easy show of contempt for her, and she let them have it. Sellswords are like cats. They prefer a dish placed and a hand that pretends not to care. She spoke to them, not of gold, not at first, but of how long men remember kings who pay well and forget kings who do not, of the way the air smells in a city where no one is afraid to sleep, of the taste of fruit that is not bought by the lash. She said nothing of the house of the undying. She kept that in the place where her tongue could not reach it. Prendyl laughed and promised her nothing. Salor laughed and promised to think about promising. Dario did not laugh. That night a boy came into her camp with a bad tattoo of a sword on his wrist and a pouch that held a letter and a finger bone. "From the man with the blue cloak," he whispered to �𝒂𝒌𝒆𝒔, shy of the queen. The letter had nothing in it that mattered but the finger bone and the way it had been tucked into the fold that would show at last. "You cannot teach a man to be brave," Dany thought, "but you can teach him to write his bravery down." Daario came the next day with half his company, and the other half fled the city before sunset with whatever they could carry. The remaining �𝒂𝒓𝒄 bands were slower to turn. The second sons sent a blunted arrow with a blunted refusal. She sent them fruit and water for their hangovers and said they could do better. They did, eventually. They took �𝒂𝒌𝒆𝒄 by changing the minds of men whose minds were for rent. It was a lesson Dany carried with her. The good masters surrendered on their knees and offered her 10 wagons of gold. She took 2 and sent 8 to Astapor and told them to tell anyone who asked that they had given everything they had. Then she opened the gates and let out a river of people that stank like a river that had been dammed too long. When they cried, she did not know what to do with her hands. When they called her mother, she wanted to lie down and be a child until nightfall. When they reached for her, she let them touch her. Jorah stood at her back like a cliff. �𝒂𝒌𝒆𝒔's cheeks were wet, and when Dany saw the tears, she looked away so as not to shame her. It is a mistake to think victory is the end of a thing. It is a door into a room where you must decide what to do with winning. Meereen lay ahead with its sphinxes straddling the road and its azure pyramids that peered into the sky like things that had hatched there. Shipmasters in Volantis began to talk at taverns in voices pitched to be overheard about a girl whose hair was moonlight and whose hands could loose your chains. The Red Temple said the old prophecies stirred in their beds. The Iron Bank counted and did not comment and then counted again. The line from �𝒂𝒌𝒆𝒄 to Meereen is a line men have traced with blood often. Dany traced it with food carts, with smiths, with a moving village of women who could stitch wounds and a handful of old men who could stitch arguments. There were skirmishes. There were nights of broken sleep and days of heat so malign that the air itself felt like a weight. There were letters from Astapor begging for more men and more bread and less mercy, and letters from �𝒂𝒌𝒆𝒄 that had been written by many hands at once and read as a single plea. There were rumors that Xaro had given her up to her enemies, that Xaro had gone bankrupt, that Xaro had married a boy with hair like new wheat and then had him killed for being unfaithful, that Xaro had sent her a ship with her name on it. Some rumors canceled each other out like numbers and some multiplied. A man in a white cloak found them 5 days from Meereen. He came riding alone with the dust on his shoulders like snow and asked in a voice carved from stone if this were the camp of Daenerys Stormborn, Queen of the Undulls and the Rhoynar and the First Men, and probably a few other titles besides. When he took off his helm, his hair was white as the cloak and his face was a map of wars. �𝒂𝒏𝒆𝒚, Jorah said, naming him under his breath, as if he were not a man but a prayer said before battle. "I served your father," Barristan said to Dany when he knelt. "I failed him at the Trident. I served the man who took his place for a time thereafter because I believed a sword ought to be where it can do good. I have come to ask a place in your guard and to warn you of a thing I learned in the hall of a small king who thinks himself a large one." "Rise," she said, because her heart had risen and she had to tell something to obey her. He waited until night to tell her the rest. He stood in the lamplight and the lamplight moved in old lines on his face. He told her that Jorah Mormont had once written letters to men in red cloaks and gold mail. He told her that the bear had spied for the usurper who had wronged her blood. The room emptied of air and of speech. Jorah did not look at Barristan while the telling was told. He looked at her. His eyes were blue the way deep water is blue, and she could not tell whether that meant they were cold or whether it meant they were deep. "Is it true?" she asked. Her voice had returned to her, felt older. "It is," he said. "It was." He did not kneel. "I sang a song I had the words for when I was alone and my debts were heavier than any armor. Paid for the next verse. And then I met you, and then I stopped knowing how to sing it. You should have told me. I thought perhaps the world would let me keep that cowardice," he said. "The world is not that kind. She banished him at dawn. She did it in the square where she had eaten a breakfast of figs and stale bread. The men heard and looked at their hands because they did not wish to be present for the breaking of a thing they believed in. 𒒂💐💈 stood at her shoulder, small and straight and quiet with the pain you have when the mother who cut your bread cuts her finger and you cannot stop the blood. Jorah rode away as if the distance were a punishment he accepted and did not understand. Dany watched until he was a scrape on the horizon and then until he was nothing. Barristan did not speak. It is a gift to know when to speak and when not to. He had that gift. Meereen did not fall easily. It is not in the nature of old cities to do anything easily. Dany did not have dragons to fly over the walls and make the men beneath them remember the old stories. She had a 𒒂💂💄𝒅 had given her without a smile and with a remark about how his honor was not a thing that required anyone else to like it. She had Grey Worm and men who had learned their names and learned to make a line hold without thinking of who had told them to hold it. She had Daario, whose courage was a flower in the way that a flower is both fragile and impossible to ignore. She had Barristan, whose sword was a courier for his memory. They went in by night through water that smelled of old meals and older sins. They came up in a granary where sacks of millet stood taller than men. They fought through a street named for stars because at some long ago time it had been the only place in the old city from which the night sky was worth remarking on. They took a tower and then a gate and then the space beyond the gate where men fell and would not move when the trumpet sounded the call that says this part is done. In the morning Meereen woke free and did not know how to breathe. It is not easy to teach a city to inhale. Dany tried. She sat on a throne made of polished basalt and listened to an endless stream of men who wished to say she was wrong. She married Hizdahr zo Loraq to see if she could bridle hate with habit. She refused the fighting pits until refusing them set the city's teeth on edge. She opened them again with rules and regrets and the certain knowledge that rules and regrets make poor companions. For blood, the sons of the Harpy came in silk and left in blood and returned in masks. They killed in alleys and in bright rooms without shame. Dany sent patrols. She closed taverns and opened schools. She sat with 𒒂💐💈 over bowls of black bean soup and wrote laws no one had written before and realized she had never wanted to write laws. She had wanted to go home. The words looked back at her from the parchment and did not tell her how to do it. The pale mare came in with a wail and moved through the camps like a lost woman. She killed slowly when she was in a good mood and quickly when she was not. Dany closed the gates and set tents at distances and burned beds. She woke at night with her mouth tasting of smoke and thought of the dragon's blue eye. News came from Qarth like a rumor that had learned a good way to cross water. The house of the Undying burned blue at night now. Men said, a cold fire like a lantern hung above the city. The 13 were no longer 13 and the pureborn had been made impure. The warlocks sent dreams into men that were not theirs. They sent a boy with lips painted blue to a ship anchored far from their harbor. The boy spoke into the captain's ear and the captain put his hand into the brazier to see what truth was. He did not scream because his truth was small and hard and the warlocks loved size and softness. The captain's hand was a black flower when he took it out again. The boy smiled. Qarth stood above Dany's bed one night as if she had always stood there. The mask was darker in the failing light. You have crossed, she said. You have broken chains. I cannot break the one that is in me, Dany said. I cannot stop wanting what was mine before I knew what mine meant. You were born in a storm, Qarth said. You will not forget it. The Undying drink your remembrance. They sent the gift because they wanted to see you weep. Dany thought of the little body in the blanket and of the way the blue eye had looked at her. They saw me burn him, she said. They were pleased. You count that as a mercy, Qarth said. They count it as an altar. Will you speak plainly for once? Dany demanded. Must I go back? You must go forward, Qarth said. But forward is sometimes around, sometimes through. Their power is an old sore they keep from healing. They make it into jewelry and hang it on the city's throat to see if it will choke. Go with ships. Go with men whose feet remember sand. Take no gifts. Kill the first man who smiles with a blue mouth. Dany woke with her hands in fists again and with 𒒂💐💈 sitting beside her, wide-eyed. I do not like the way you breathe when you sleep, 𒒂💐💈 confessed, and Dany loved her for the absurd truth of it. She asked for ships. The Meereenese counted and said they had fewer than they remembered. The Yunkish surrounded them and asked for a queen who would let them go back to their old lives, which were so much simpler. The sellswords of the second sons weighed their loyalties on scales made of habit and made of coin and found habit wanting. 𒒂💆 drew the sword he had drawn 1,000 times, and �𝒂💓 set his men where the killing would be neat. They held the walls through a morning and an afternoon and a night. In the morning after that, the sky to the south was gray with sails. They were not Qarthine. They were �𝒂💉, 3 great black ships with eyes painted on their prows and a beak of bronze and a hunger for the old �𝒂𝒉 wealth that was a hunger all the old cities shared. Behind them came others, ships of men who had heard that there was much to do and much to be bought doing it. Dany went down to the harbor where the water cupped the hulls like rough hands and looked at her reflection in it. The sea made it into a stranger she would have recognized in a crowd. She sent gifts and messengers and rules. She sent men who had no tongues but could write and men who had tongues but knew when not to use them. She sent �𝒐𝒏𝒈 once, and the �𝒂💉 would not look at her because she was a girl and because she was a �𝒕𝒉, and they are a small people in a large world. �𝒐𝒏𝒈 spoke anyway, and when the first scion did not answer and then asked her name as if it mattered only because he had to fill a silence, �𝒐𝒏𝒈 said her name in a way that made it the largest thing in that room. When she returned she was shaking, and Dany held her hand under the table so that the men with chains around their necks would not see. The men with chains around their necks always see, but sometimes they pretend not to. Dany took the ships that were offered and left the ones that were not. She called for every shipwright in the city and gave them cedar and bronze and a wage paid in advance. She moved meat and salt and water and small children into holds and prayed for the favor of every god she had ever named. She made peace with Yunkai on a page and with a knife hidden under it. She spoke to the Green Grace and to �𝒂💄💆 and to men who had held knives for each other and did not now. She had 𒒂💆 stand beside her without speaking and Dario behind her and �𝒂💓 ahead. She whispered to the dead thing in the ashes that she would fix the place where he had been broken. They sailed with a wind that remembered the gulf between wants and what the world allows. The sea was not kind. Seas are seldom kind to women who think they can cross them and arrive as they intend. Dany was sick twice and laughed once. She could not help it. When the ship pitched and she fell and 𒒂💆 caught her like a child. He said nothing. He had never learned to tease. �𝒐𝒏𝒈 sat with her on the steps and told her a story about a butterfly that had been born in a storm and could not fly because it had forgotten how, and the storm told it, "You are a fish." The jade gates rose like teeth from the water. Qarth's walls were tall and white and meant to be looked at. Banners spilled down them like cloth bleeding, all colors that were expensive to make. The house of the Undying peered over everything from its dead tower. At night, as they anchored at a distance where the big ships could turn without scraping, the tower glowed the cold blue �𝒂𝒃 had named. It painted a line across the water that found Dany's face and laid itself there as if it belonged. Xaro sent a barge with a carpet on it and a man with oil in his voice and jewels in his beard. "Our love has not dimmed," Xaro began. "Nor your greed," Dany answered. "Take me to the house." "You cannot mean to." "Take me." He took her. It is hard to keep a queen from the place she intends to go when she has come in with sails full and with 100 men whose faces say they will die before they turn the ship around. The city swallowed their column and tried to slow it down with hawkers and songs and girls in wet silk. But the men at the edges had spears and their faces had nothing in them. When Dany came to the long dead garden and the low pale house, the air changed. Sound did strange things. The light lifted as if it had always been a little heavy. "You cannot burn them," Xaro said. "You cannot cut them. You cannot make a bargain with them. You will not regret more than any bargain you have ever made." "Then I will do the thing that is left," Dany said and nodded to �𝒂💓. They had learned to fight magic by refusing to look at it. The first rank threw earthen pots filled with pitch and oil. They burst on the plaster and sent thick black fire up the walls like ivy. The second rank threw hooks and ropes and pulled down vines with dead blossoms and dead birds in them until the smoke turned white and bitter and burned the soft places in men's mouths. �𝒐𝒏𝒈 stood under a canopy of leather with a wet cloth over her nose and wrote everything down as if it would one day be needed by some other queen who did not have the luxury of learning the same lesson the hard way. The Undying did not come out of their house. They sent their faces out on other faces. A boy ran into the fire thinking it was a garden. A woman named her children and then remembered she had none. A man began to sing in a beautiful voice and did not stop when a spear went through his liver. 𒒅💄 walked forward as if the air were clean. He cut and was not cut. Men followed him because following was safer than thinking. The tower shrieked. You cannot call such a sound anything human. It was a thing dragged over a stone until both were changed. Dany went forward with a cloak soaked in water and wrapped around her hair because Jorah had taught her, long ago in the Red Waste, that there are small things that keep you alive. She had no dragon. She had her feet and her breath and the promise she had made to a dead thing under a sky of ash. The first door was a mouth again, and this time she did not step into it. She stepped past it to where the wall was at its thinnest and where the old stones had not been laid well, and she said, "Here." The fourth rank had hammers. The fifth had ladders. The sixth had fear and used it to move. The seventh was men who had nothing in common but the desire to see this done. The wall came down like a curtain in a theater. The light inside was wrong. It was blue in the way bruises are blue. 𒒂💏 stood in the yard in the middle of a circle drawn in some dark liquid. He did not appear to be breathing. He might not have needed to. His mouth was the blue of flowers that grow on graves. "You have come back," he said. There were a dozen of him, all saying the same words, always from a different place, a different mouth. "You have come to see your future. I have come to finish my past," Dany said, and moved her hand. Grey Worm's spear went through one of the 𒒂💏s, and the man dissolved like the idea of a man. 𒒅💏 took the head from another, and both head and body turned to dry powder when they parted. Daario flicked his braid over his shoulder and blew a kiss at a third before he opened him from knee to neck. The blue that spilled out smoked on the stones and smelled of the shade of the evening cups. The circle that was drawn did not break. The light did not change. "Do you want to see them?" 𒒂💏 asked from 6 places at once. "Do you want to see your little lizards, your small storms? Do you want to see what they have become without you?" "No," Dany said. "I want you to see me." She walked into the song of blue light, touched her skin like ice. Men shouted behind her and wise men tried to hold her back. She allowed no hands on her. You cannot ask someone else to end the thing that began in your blood. The room inside the room had no corners. It had cages hanging from chains that were not made of iron and could not be made of iron. The things within them were almost hers and not hers at all. One had grown in a way that was not growth. Its wings were long and delicate as paper, and when it breathed something in the air shivered and was colder. Another crouched with its head bowed and its tail wound around its legs, as if it meant to be a statue for as long as the world asked it to be. The third was a shadow with weight. They did not know her. Blue light poured over their eyes and out again, taking something with it. Someone made a sound that might have been her. She could not let go of the breath in her chest. She went to the nearest cage and put her hand on it. It burned. It did not burn the way fire burns. It drew the heat out of her palm until she felt she was being unmade. She gripped harder. "Daenerys," 𒒅💏 said in a voice that was only for her, the voice men use when someone is falling and there is no time at all. "Bring me oil," she said. "Bring me salt. Bring me steel. Bring me wood." They brought what they had. Xaro, who had followed despite himself, stood in the doorway biting his knuckle as if he could chew his greed into patience. Missandei came with a lamp and a ladle and the quiet of a child in a room where a mother is fixing a thing that cannot be fixed. Grey Worm kept the men back with his spear, not because they were cowards but because they were brave, and bravery is contagious. Daario watched the shadows the way a man watches a lover undress. Dany poured the oil at the base of the cages. She poured it with hands that shook and did not spill any. She set the lamp in the oil and stepped back. The fire that took was not the fire that comes from wood. It was a dead fire that ate backwards and left warmth as ash. She threw the salt into it. The flames turned a color that hurt to look at. She lifted the steel and struck at the chain that held the first cage. When it fell, the sound it made unstitched the skin along her arms. "Do you think you will be forgiven?" 𒒂💏 asked from 3 mouths and then 6 and then 12. Do you think any god was watching when you made this choice, who will not turn his face away when you ask to be comforted? I do not ask, Dany said, and raised the steel again. The chains broke one by one. The cages fell into the wrong fire, and the wrong fire ate them, and the blue light changed a little, a breath at a time. The things within did not scream, and that was worse than if they had. When the last chain gave and the last cage fell and the last of the blue light shivered and died, something else happened, a relief as sharp as grief. The house of the undying groaned. It is only an image to say a house groaned, but houses do groan when they are being asked to stand and cannot. 𒒂💏 vanished. He did not die because there was nothing of him to die. He withdrew like water when a hand is taken out of it. Xaro made a small, involuntary noise and covered it with a cough. The tower above them tilted a finger's width and then straightened again, and dust came down like a blessing. Men began to shout in the outer yard and then to laugh. Some of them cried because they were done. Dany stood in the smoke. She had ash in her mouth and wrong light in her eyes that would not go out. She felt old. She felt young. She felt the part of her that had been the mother of dragons become the mother of something else. A people, perhaps, a promise, a fury that was not fire and would still take. We are finished here, she said. We will go. Xaro followed her down the steps as if he had always belonged 2 paces behind her. You have done a thing, he said. The city will not forgive you for doing it without them. The warlocks will not forgive you for doing it at all. The 13 will take an oath with each other to remember that you do not need them and to punish you for teaching them that. I will not be here to be punished, she said. You may tell them so. Where will you go? His voice was silk again, but it was silk that had been washed once too often. Home, she said, and when he smiled as if she had told a joke, she did not join him. They went home by way of Meereen, because you cannot go anywhere in this world without going through the places you have already been. The bay stank of fish and triumph, and the sweet rot that comes after a plague has had its dinner. The people came out to see her. Some shouted that she had left and returned as if she had never gone, and therefore she had not left them at all. Some shouted that she had left and the city had suffered, and therefore she was a bad mother. Some shouted that they had eaten bread all week and it had had more stones than bread in it. The sons of the harpy had painted a harpy on a wall with pig's blood and had written words beneath it that a child could have read if a child had wanted to. We remember. She stood on the steps of her black throne and listened to petitions until her ears rang. She heard a woman ask for her husband back from a pit he had fallen in during the fighting, and she said she could not climb down into it for her. She heard a boy ask for a place on a ship, and she gave him one. She heard �𝒂💏 ask for a free hand, and Hizdahr ask that his hands be less watched. She let Barristan speak when he wanted to and did not make him when he did not. She let Daario talk too much and then told him to be quiet with her eyes. She slept on clean linen and had dreams full of ash. In the morning she walked to the harbor and looked west. The sky in that direction is a wall you can lean your forehead against if you are tired. She leaned. �𝒐𝒏𝒈 stood beside her with a scroll in her hands and a list in her mouth and 100 concerns prickling her skin. The girl read the names of ships and their masters, tonnage and crew, water and grain, oil and rope. She read the names of 3 small children who had no one to see them off, and the name of the dog that would not be left behind, whose owner would not be left behind without him. She read the words that needed saying. Are we ready? Dany asked when she finished, though she knew there is no ready for this work. There is only the moment when you pick up the first thing and pick up the second. As much as anyone could be, �𝒐𝒏𝒈 said, and her voice was old for a breath before it remembered she was young. Barristan wore his white cloak and looked at the sea with a soldier's disgust for distances you cannot measure by marching. Grey worms stood with the unsullied in lines that had names now, and each man had an expression he wore without being ordered to. Daario chewed a sprig of something that tasted like bitterness and made sweet of it with a grin. I lost them, Dany said aloud to the water, because the water knows all the things men say to it. I lost them and I did not get them back. �𝒐𝒏𝒈 slid her small hand into Dany's large one. You found us, she said. Dany stood a while longer while the wind came up and the masts creaked and the gulls cursed the living with the ease of the dead. She thought of Qarth and her riddles that had turned into directions. She thought of Xaro and his oils and his smiles and the empty place in his vault where he kept the knowledge that he could not keep what was not his. She thought of 𒑕💂💄 and wondered if anything that is not a man can die in a way that matters to men, and she decided that it could. When she turned, the city was behind her and ahead of her both. The sea was a road and an enemy and a mirror. She smiled without meaning to. It was not a smile of joy. It was a smile of someone who has made a list, and that list will be done. The fleet moved with the tide. Meereen's harbor shrank behind them until it was a patch sewn onto the cloth of the shore. Yunkai was a dust of gold under a hot sky. Astapor was a smudge that might be sorrow or might be something else. Qarth was a rumor. Westeros lay 1,000 stories away, and each of those stories had a mountain and a river and a wrong turn and a dead end. She was not alone. Barristan stood with his hands behind his back and the wind flattening his hair. Grey Worm watched his men instead of the horizon. �𝒐𝒏𝒈 checked her lists and then checked them again. Daario told a joke to a sailor that made the man laugh like a man coming up from water. Dany stood in their midst and felt the space where dragons would have been. She did not try to fill it with anything but herself. Night fell like a cloak laid over a sleeping child. The stars came out. They made a road in the sky, and Dany realized with a small surprise that she had learned to read it. She would go where it pointed. She would go where it did not. She would go until there were no more roads left, and then she would find out what a woman became when she reached the place where the world ended and did not drop away. In her mind, she built a fire in a garden of white stone and fed it the last blue thing she had. She watched it burn and did not look away. In the morning there would be work. In 𒑕💂💄💄 morning there would be voices. In the morning the west would be just as far and just as near. She put her hand on the rail. The ship's wood was warm with sun and with all the hands that had held it. The world breathed. She breathed back. The wind found the sails. The fleet swung its long bodies out upon the water and moved. Under the keel the sea dreamed its huge slow dreams, and above it the gulls turned and called to each other. And between them was a girl with a crown no one could take because it did not sit on her head. She did not look behind her again. The past would follow regardless. She watched the line of the horizon until it was not a line but a promise, and then until it was not a promise but a place, and then until she forgot to name it anything at all. The first gull to find them was a ragged thing with a torn wingtip and a cry like an old hinge. It rode a slip of wind along the line of the mainmast and lit on the rail not 3 paces from Daenerys, cocking its head as if to peer at the pale braid that lay across her shoulder. The sea beyond it was hammered tin in the dawn, cold and flat, and the wind that had filled their sails through half the night had turned fickle and played its little games among the rigging. Barristan Selmy rested the heel of one hand on the rail and frowned at the gull as if it might reveal a stratagem. "The nearer the coast, the more they grow bold," he said. "In King's Landing they snatch bread from a child's hand. I have seen it. Then they have learned to eat," Dany said. "It is another thing to learn to share," �𝒐𝒏𝒈 murmured, and the gull hopped twice, made its little hinge cry, and lifted away. They held the easterlies through the day. Toward evening cloud rose in a low, bruised wall ahead, and by moonrise the bruises had spread. The ship's lanterns were hooded, and the crew moved in the silent way of men who have learned to leave their talking for land. Dany stood with her cloak thrown back and let the promised rain find her face. Grey Worm came up from below, helmet under his arm, the scar in his cheek an old unreadable line. "Khaleesi," he said, and waited until she looked. "There is a swimmer." Barristan was already moving. The shout came from the larboard watch, thin in the dark. Something seen and lost, a ripple where no ripple ought to be, the delicate ring of a knife point kissing wood. The sea at night is full of things that are not there. This was not one of them. "Poles," Barristan said, and men ran for the boarding pikes while others leaned out with grapnels, stabbing at black water. The ship rose and fell. Dany smelled oil. She tasted brass. The sound came again, nearer. A hand on a rung, skin on wet rope. Grey Worm went there at a trot, quiet as a cat, and the man that came up over the rail met a spear point in the soft place under the jaw. He had painted his lips the blue of evening bowls. Another followed. Dario reached that one first, hauling him up with a smile as if from a bath and kissing his blue mouth in mockery before he let him feel the knife. The man tried to spit a word and choked on his own color. A third was quicker, up and over, blade low. Barristan's sword chimed. It is a beautiful sound, the bright sure ring of good steel finding something hard. The blue-lipped man sagged around the blade as if in thanks. Warlocks, �𝒂𝒓𝒄 said, as if he needed to name the color. Or their dogs, Barristan said. The dead men had no pouches for coin. They wore no tokens save the paint and a twist of indigo cloth about each wrist. �𝒂𝒉 stood with a hood thrown over her hair and watched without flinching as the bodies went over the side. The sea took them without protest. When Dany turned to her, she said, in the voice she used for the smallest children, "The house is far, but the house has long arms. We cut one," Dany said. "We will cut the other." The storm broke before dawn and passed as if it had been paid to hurry, leaving a dapple of brightness in its wake. By mid-morning gulls were a chorus along the wake, and far to port the coast of Essos unrolled like a faded tapestry. Sedge and salt marsh, low headlands, a scatter of villages whose roofs shone like old coins when the sun found them. Toward noon, towers, thin black pricks against the sky, then broader, more, rank on rank, and white walls catching light the way a blade catches it. Volantis lay upon the Rhoyne like a cat across a warm lap, its black walls old as grief and twice as patient. The harbor smelled of tar and fish and something sweet that had no business at a wharf. Triarch's barges with their peacock's tails of silk moved in stately lines, oars biting water in perfect cadence. On the quay, slaves in collars of bronze and of iron and of plain rope swarmed like ants. Farther inland, beyond the broken old bridge and the newer one with its gaudy saints and sinners, the red temple's fires were a fist thrust up at heaven. They did not make the inner moorings. The captains had their orders and their superstitions both. Dany's fleet lay outside the true bustle, clustered under a forest of masts. Envoys came out in painted boats, an elephant with his hair perfumed and his hands plump as loaves, a tiger with eyes the color of steel shavings and a smile that did not find his mouth, a priest with a shaved scalp and a robe the orange of embers. The priest spoke first. "Benerro has dreamed," he said through a man who had been taught to make every word taste of smoke. "The night is deep, and a woman shall bear a sword of waking. Light bends toward her. Light bends toward whoever holds a mirror," Dario said under his breath, and Barristan gave him a look which, being wasted, passed through him like weather. Dany kept her voice level. "Will Benerro sell me ships?" "Ships turn," said the priest, smiling as if it were a riddle and a kindness. "What turns for gold can turn for prayer, and what turns for prayer can turn for blood. The Triarchs are divided." "Then there is hope," �𝒂𝒉 murmured. "There is always hope where men are divided." The elephant envoy spoke with the soft clink of bracelets an elephant means you to hear. He was ready to be moved by coin, by promise, by any lane that led him to a larger house. The tiger smiled like a cat that had been promised cream and asked for a guarantee from someone whose guarantee had once mattered and might again. They argued over harborage fees and victuals and whether Dany's men could set foot within the black walls. They could not. And how many kegs of clear water made a good bargain when the river ran to salt in summer? They stayed 3 days and did not stay. On the second, a speech was made in the square before the Red Temple, and when the crowd roared, men on the quays remembered that once the world had believed in dragons and in queens who walked out of fire smiling. On the third, a boy tried to cut �𝒂𝒉's purse and found �𝒂𝒓𝒄's hand around his wrist. The boy wept until �𝒂𝒉 gave him bread and a copper and told him where the Nothy fishers sold their nets. On the fourth morning, the fleet slid back downriver on an ebb tide, and Volantis turned its attention to itself as all great cities do. They kept the coast under their lee thereafter. Myr lay low and cunningly pretty in the haze, Tyrosh gaudier than any whore, lists like a jewel fallen into a mud puddle. The stepstones rose out of the sea like the bones of a great beast that had forgotten to be buried. There, in the windless noons and the quick tangle of currents, the ships learned to speak to one another in creek and canvas. There too came pirates with tapestries for sails and narrow faces that had been trimmed by hunger. The first fight came sudden. A Lycini galley with a painted prow and a boarding net rigged to fall like a fisherman's kiss. Barristan saw the net go up and shouted, and Grey Worm's shields were rising before the canvas spilled, and the net came down on wood and leather and men who had learned to push in unison. Dario laughed like a man in bed and leapt for the Lycini rail. He fought the way he smiled, with his whole face. The pirate captain was a woman with hair the color of old gold. She died with her hand full of Dany's sleeve, and Dany pried the fingers off one by one and laid them gently on the deck. They fought twice more before the chain of isles fell astern. The sea bought its peace with blood and went back to its cold, indifferent breathing. Night by night, the constellation that sailors call the Queen's Bird climbed a little higher. Dany watched it from the stern castle, and when 𝒔𝒐𝒏𝒈 came up to lay a shawl across her shoulders, the girl said, "In Noth we call that a butterfly. The elders say it is the first of all butterflies, the one that taught the others how to fly." And who taught the first? The wind. �𝒐𝒏𝒈 smiled a small, quick smile. The wind puts its hands under everything. They found Illyrio's men at sea before they found Illyrio. It was a neat trick. The fat magister's banner, 3 yellow candles on a field of black, hung from the stern of a �🗔💂💄 whose captain wore his beard in ringlets bound with Myrish lace. He bowed until his belly pressed the rail and made it creak. "My master embraces your grace with tears in his eyes," he declaimed, "and begs you to accept the hospitality of Pentos, whose inns are cleaner than her promises. Does he weep for Viserys in the same breath?" Dany asked, and the captain blinked 3 times, which told her enough. They came into Pentos by afternoon with the wind slantwise and the harbor choked with ships that had been remembered yesterday and forgotten today. The city lay like a man trying to be graceful while he sat too long at dinner. Illyrio's palace was cool within, its floors a map of little stones set precisely where they wished to be, its fountains whispering. The magister himself came out with arms spread and cheeks wet. "Child of my heart," he cried, and paused to be moved. Princess became queen, whom the gods caress with a wind made sweeter by her hair. "Ah, forgive me, your grace, I am overcome." "You are seldom overcome when there is an opportunity," Barristan muttered behind her, but low so that only Dany heard. Illyrio's embrace was a warm bath. He smelled of cinnamon and of oil. He looked older, men do, but not poorer. He had important news, and he kept it for the 3rd course, after the pigeon pies and before the quartons of lemon water arrived on a silver tray. "There is a boy," he said then, spreading his soft hands so that the rings caught the candlelight and sent it skipping. "A prince. I have kept his name secret so long that to say it aloud in this room makes my heart knock. Aegon." Barristan's hand stopped halfway to his cup. He did not set it down. He did not drink. He held it there, an old man's hand made steady by a lifetime's work, and looked into Illyrio's eyes as if they were a lock and he were trying keys. "Dead," he said softly. "I saw the bodies when I still wore white, a child's head in a crimson cloak." "Children are often smaller than kings believe," Illyrio said. "Faces are often less sure when they are apart from their names. We live in a world of mistakes, my sweet friends. This would not be the first, nor the last." "Where is this boy?" Dany asked, and when Illyrio said, "At sea, as all wise princes are when fools are hunting," her mouth tasted suddenly of salt and of memory. He spoke of the Golden Company, of elephants that could not be brought over water, of griffins that were only men and still dangerous. He spoke of a landing planned in the Stormlands, of a banner raised where storms have always practiced on men. He spoke of Connington, who had been disgraced once upon a time and now had found a way to make disgrace into a weapon. He spoke of Rhaegar's son as if the name could be remade by the saying. It is not an easy thing to sit still while someone suggests you are not what you are. Dany listened. She asked questions that tasted of ash. When she parted from Illyrio that night, she walked the long corridors with 𝒔𝒐𝒏𝒈 at her side and let the quiet pool around her like cool water. And when they reached the courtyard where fig trees grew, she stopped beneath one and said, to no one in particular. If he is a lie, he will be unmade by light. If he is a truth, it is a truth I was not given. And what will you do? �𝒐𝒏𝒈 asked. What I came to do, Dany said. But I will not be the only Targaryen in any man's mouth unless the gods intend it. In the morning, a new courier came through Illyrio's gates during breakfast and stood, dusty and shy, in the tiled hall while the Magister clapped his hands for fruit. The man had dark Dornish eyes and a lizard lion tattooed small on the inside of one wrist, as if he had wanted to hide it and could not. His letter was sealed with a signet Dany had not seen before, a sun and spear pressed deep in yellow wax. The letter did not waste words. Prince Doran of Sunspear, Lord of the Water Gardens, Warden of the Sandship, sent his compliments to Daenerys Targaryen, styling her queen, naming her Stormborn, noting gently that storms came to Dorne first and left Dorne last. Dorne remembered. Dorne forgave cleverly, knowing that forgiveness is a way of counting who owes what. Dorne invited. The word was chosen carefully. It did not say, come. It said, if. At its end were written lines that were not a demand but could be read as one if you needed to be angry. House Martell would hazard its spears and its water and the quiet of its gardens for the sake of old ties that had been honored in blood. It would be pleased, in time, to see those ties made new again with vows, if such vows could be happily sworn. The girl Arianne was fertility made flesh and a will in jewels. The boy Quentyn was stout and dutiful and had learned, Dern men said, to find his way in the dark without stumbling. Prince Doran suggested that even in the absence of dragons, a marriage could be meat for old hunger. Even in the absence, Dany murmured, her eyes on the neat script. He says it without saying it. He is a man who has always said things that way, Barristan said. What would you have me answer, sire? That you will go? Barristan said, and folded his hands as if to pray. Dorne is the only place in Westeros where you will not be hounded on sight. The Martells paid for Rhaegar's choices with Elia and her children. They will not forget. That makes them dangerous. It also makes them useful, and perhaps true. True is a word men use when they like the taste of their plan, Daario said, flicking a fig seed from his tongue. Dorne is dry. The women wear knives and the men look at you like they have swallowed a lemon and are ashamed to spit it out. But the wine is not bad. �𝒐𝒏𝒈 watched Dany's face, the way a shore watches the sky for weather. We can go and see, she said softly. They went. Illyrio wept and pressed casks on them and gave them 2 more ships and a promise to send word to the boy he named Aegon, which Dany did not ask for. Pento's low roofs and high lies fell behind. The stepstones rose again. For 3 days they sailed past rocks where cormorants sat as if in judgment and through channels where the sea ran in a hurry as though late for an appointment with itself. Then, one evening when the light had gone thin and thoughtful, a single red sail came up from the south like a tongue of flame licking the lip of the world. The ship flew no banner. It came on without hurry, with the confidence of a vessel that knows every trap in these waters is already her friend. When she drew near, Dany saw women on her decks with black hair and knife belts, and at the prow a figurehead carved as a woman with her mouth open in laughter. A gangplank was thrown and caught with a soft, sure clatter. A princess came across first, though the word was not announced. She wore orange and copper, the color of afternoon, and her hair coiled like serpents under a net of gold. Her skin was sundark and her smile unkind only if you did not like to see teeth. She bowed as one woman bows to another when no man needs to be soothed by it. Arianne Martell, she said. Dorne's patience. The corner of her mouth twitched. Or so my father names me. My lady, Dany said, and kept her face open and her hand visible. You have your father's courage. He would rather I had his caution, Arianne said, and let her eyes run over Barristan with keen curiosity and over Grey Worm with keener. She spared Daario a glance that lingered half a breath longer than courtesy required and did not bother to hide her calculation. You were taller in the stories. Stories are written by men who sit, Dany said. Standing changes the view. They spoke in the shade of an awning while the sea made its little lapping conversations below. Arianne had come without banners because banners tear in the wrong wind. She had come with waterskins perfumed faintly with lemon and with a basket of flatbread still warm, and she broke the bread with her own fingers and salted it and handed Dany the first piece as if to say, "These are my manners, you will know them. You will be safer in Dorne than anywhere else that calls itself Westeros," she said, "and less safe there than you might like. Word travels along the Bone Way faster than a hawk. If you land at the Prince's Pass, the Marcher Lords will know it before the spray has dried on your faces. If you come in at Salt Shore, the sea will gossip for you from the Arbor to Old Town. Then we go where the world cannot speak at once," Barristan said. "Planky Town. The green blood men will swallow a secret if a Martell asks." Arianne weighed him with her eyes the way a woman weighs a bolt of cloth. "We could make planks into a floor," she said, "or a pyre." "You came to offer more than warnings," Dany said. "What does your father want?" "For Dorne to choose its own griefs," Arianne said honestly, which pleased Dany more than a flattery would have. "For Elijah's ghosts to stop pulling at his sleeves when he eats. For his children to live. To stand once more on a balcony and look out over an orchard and think only of when the fruit will be sweet. He knows he cannot have all of this. He will take the largest piece he can get without choking." "And what will you take?" Arianne's smile was a small blade. "Power fits me, your grace. I have been stitched for it since I was born. I would have it and wear it and not apologize when it suits me. If that offends, you and I will quarrel. If it delights, we shall be sisters." Dany thought of Viserys, who had wanted everything and could not hold a cup. She thought of the girl of the thousand sighs, whose sighs had always been for someone else. She thought of Missandei's careful hands. "We will land," she said. "We will not swear any vows today. If your father would hazard Dorne for me, I will hazard my pride for him. That is fair." "It is nearly Dornish," Arianne said, amused. "Come then, let me show you first the river that unteaches men to make war." They came up the green blood by night, oars muffled, lanterns hooded. The banks were black with tamarisk and with the shadows of trees that grew like children in the shallows, half in, half out of the water's care. 100 boats were strung along the docks at Planky Town like beads on string. 100 more pushed gently at their moorings, homes and shops and gossip all at once. The Rhoynar-descended boatmen watched with faces the color of good earth and said nothing, which is a kindness when men break the habit of sleep. Doran Martell did not come to the dock. He sent a litter and men who moved with the patience that comes from pain. Ariohat stood at the foot of the gangplank with his long axe upright as a standard, his beard threaded with a single piece of copper wire. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had learned how to be a wall. "Your Grace," he said, and his voice was a drum heard through a door. "The prince greets you and begs pardon that he cannot walk under the same sky as you yet. The gout has its teeth in him again. He commands me to be your shadow until he can offer you shade." "I have had worse shadows," Dany said, and Areo bowed his great head as if to let her step onto it. The water gardens received them with the mildness of water and of stone that had been asked only to be beautiful for a very long time. Children ran shouting between the shallow pools in a dozen shifting tongues, and women in veils sat beneath orange trees and made small work with fine needles. Doran Martell waited in a cool loggia above a long, low basin where fish flashed like small coins. He wore a robe the color of pomegranates split for drying and had the hands of a man who has learned to be careful with himself. When Dany came near, he tried to rise and could not. His mouth twisted with the shame of it, and he waved them closer instead. "My lady," he said, and Arianne's chin ticked, the smallest flinch at the old habit. "My queen, you honor this house that remembers yours. I will honor it in turn," Dany said, "though I may ask a price for the honoring." The prince smiled a little. "We are accustomed." They spoke while children splashed and shrieked, and a breeze stirred the veils so that they lifted and lay down again like breath. Doran's voice was soft and exact. He did not say he had waited. He did not say the name Elia. He did not say dragons. He spoke of roads instead, and of wells, and of the way the Bone Way eats men like a mad dog eats meat. He spoke of the marcher lords who will ride for any lion that promises them a bigger pasture, and of the Tyrell roses who would rather faint prettily than lose a harvest. He spoke of ravens and of words that would arrive before they ought to be possible. He spoke of money because he was a prince and had learned that in the end men always do. "We cannot lift you upon a wind," he said. "We can give you a place to set your ladder. Choose your first wall wisely. The Stormlands would love to be courted. They would love it a little less if your kinsman courts them first with 10,000 cells words singing him awake. The Reach has bread and banners but will not move until the Lannister gold shifts hands. The North has its own weather. The Riverlands have bled enough for 5 kingdoms." "Aegon," Dany said, tasting the name. Doran's lids lowered and rose in the slow blink of a lizard warming. "There is a boy," he said. "We have had word of him that makes my sister's ghost sit on the edge of my bed at night and twist the rings upon her finger. If he is true, he was hidden from us. Hiding is a kind of lie. If he is false, he is an injury. Injuries sometimes make better kings than lies make princes." Barristan's hands had settled on the back of a chair and stayed there, white. "I would see him," he said. "So would I," Dany said. "But first we will make it so that he must see me." The council that followed ran long into the shaded afternoon and out again into the gold light. 𝒂𝒑 stood like a tree carved out of darker wood. The sand snakes came and went like cats. Obara with her spear and her impatience. Nymeria with a quirk at the corner of her mouth that made men think unwise thoughts. Tyene soft as bread and twice as dangerous. Quentyn came last, brought by Arianne like a child brought forward to apologize for the cake. He had his father's slow build and a face that would look better in laughter than it did in frown. He bowed to Dany with stiff gravity and did not quite know what to do with his hands. "You are dutiful," Dany said afterward to Arianne when they walked a long pergola where grapes had been taught to be a roof. "He is dutiful. It is one way to live. It is one way to die," Arianne said frankly. "But there are worse. Will you have him? Will he have me?" Dany asked, and when Arianne laughed like a bell, she said, "If I must marry for a road and a harvest, I will. But I would not see him broken by me or I by him. Let us win first. The vows will be sweeter if they are more expensive." "You speak almost as if you were born here," Arianne said, and this time her smile was not a blade. They did not sleep much the next week. Men came at dawn with petitions. Men came at dusk with wine. Missandei learned the names of houses that had never mattered to any Targaryen queen, and in the learning made them matter. Grey Worm took the Unsullied into the cool of the pre-dawn and set them to drilling on a strip of sand while small Dornish boys watched with aching envy and tried to fit themselves into a discipline like a tunic that did not belong to them. Barristan met with Danes and Fowlers and Ironwoods and taught them how to count an enemy by the way he wastes his water and how to use a canyon's echo to make a small host sound like a large one. Daario seduced 3 cousins of House Jourdain in a single afternoon and taught no one anything that could be put on a map. The first attempt on Dany's life in Dorne came with a ritual attached. It came at noon in the water gardens when the sun beat the pools into shards and the children squealed and a man with a boy's feet came in under a gardener's cap. He had the blue mouth. He came up behind a pillar and was a shadow when there should have been none. 𝒂𝒑 saw him first because he always sees. His long axe hissed, one of the most beautiful sounds in the world, and the man's head hit the tile and skidded into the pool as the body folded onto the steps. The water around the head went dark for a moment and then, weirdly, faintly blue. "Again," Dany said aloud, not to anyone, not quite. "They have a talent for bad timing, at least. It is the only kind of talent a dead house can brag of," Barristan said. The second attempt was quieter and cleverer. A little girl who had watched the Unsullied drill came to Missandei with a posy of flowers and a letter that was a painting of a lamb. Missandei reached for it with her smile on, because she smiles first, always, and Grey Worm's hand closed around her wrist before she lifted it, and he said very gently, "No," as if she were the child. He took the lamb and set it on the tiles and pressed its painted ear with the tip of his spear. The thing that woke under the paint was a handful of glass needles bound with hair and smeared with something clear. Arianne stood very still a long time after that, and later Doran told her in a tone without anger, only grief. "You see why I taught you patience. Their arms are long," Dany said. "We will shorten them." They chose the Bone Way first. The Prince's Pass would have seemed a safer lane if Dany had wanted to surprise no one. But the Bone Way cuts closer to the Stormland's soft belly, and there was word the Marcher men had already begun to drink toasts to her failure. Men who drink to a woman's failure should be served something sharp. The column that left the water gardens in fog smelled of leather and oil, and of that faint amber sweetness that clings to oranges when they are cut. Uriel Hoda led the vanguard, because he could become a wall at will and sometimes a road. Grey Worm kept the Unsullied in a tight blue box whose corners were names now, not numbers. The names slid about the ranks like fish in clear water. Barristan rode a grey courser with a stubborn mouth, and the horse and the old man bickered in low snorts that made Dario grin. Dany rode between Missandei and Arianne and felt the land thinking under her. The Bone Way choose. It is a road made by hunger through rock, a place where the sun is a knife and the shade a rumor. They came upon the first holdfast at dusk of the third day, its gates shut not against them but against whatever the men inside told themselves to be less afraid. A yellow banner hung above the gate, a boar's head black upon it. The Wills, who have never been tamed and have learned to be proud of it. They shouted down questions in voices hoarse with dust. Uriel Hoda shouted patience back. Dany did not raise her voice at all. She sat her horse and let the men on the wall see her. In the end, the gate opened not out of love but out of a calculation certain men cannot help but do. Which way keeps me alive a day longer? The first fight came on a shelf of rock not much wider than 3 horse lengths, with prickly pear flowering obscenely at the lip. The Marcher men had chosen well. A rank of pikes across the way, shields overlapped and boss to boss, with crossbowmen tucked in the clefts above like ticks. They jeered when the blue square of the Unsullied slowed and halted and set its front. Jeers turn a battle sour. A man who laughs before he bleeds forgets to keep his feet. Grey Worm raised his hand. The first rank knelt. The second set shields over them like a lid. The third and fourth braced. "Forward," Dany said, so low no one could have heard her, and yet the words seemed to make the air choose. The pikes kissed leather. The sound was like 100 door latches all lifted at once. A bolt chittered along a helmet and spun off bright. Barristan took 3 steps ahead of the blue and his sword wrote its small quick letters on the world. He does not look his age when he fights, Dany thought, and then she forced herself to watch not him but the line, the way a seam holds or starts to part. Dario and the Dornish light horse slid along the left and reappeared beyond a spur of stone like a rumor come true, screaming in different languages at once. The Marcher flank wavered, then bent, then broke. The Unsullied do not run. They do not pursue unless told. They do not cheer. When the line ahead of them fell away, they simply stopped pushing and stood, their spears held at a careful slope that said, "We will do this again when we are asked." Men in boiled leather and chain went down hard and got up slowly and looked around as if embarrassed by their blood. There were boys among them with whiskers that had never yet known a razor and men with bellies that had known too much pie. Dany had to tell herself a truth twice before she could accept it. They will kill you if you let them, whether their bellies are fat or not. By dusk the shelf was theirs. The enemy had fled back up the cut to a little circle of stones that had been a watchtower once and was now a memory. Dany did not send her men to pry it apart. She had no wish to pay for rocks with breath when she would need both tomorrow. She made camp where the wind would carry their smoke away and their talk toward the men on the heights. "News," she said at the fire, and they gave it to her like food. How many bolts left, how the water tasted at the last spring, what the scouts saw of hooves and of heels. Missandei wrote and wrote, her neat hand soothing the day's anger. And when Dany was done hearing everything that could be heard, she sat back and let the aches rise in her like a slow tide. A raven came at dawn as if to atone for the night. It found them halfway between 2 bends of the road and dropped from the pale sky with a soft, sure stiffness. Stu bore no seal, she knew. The letter within smelled of damp and old wood and some man's anxious hands. Storm's end had fallen, the word said. A griffin banner flew over its old round towers. A blue-eyed boy had put his foot upon its wet stone and called men to him with a name that tasted like both bread and betrayal. He had friends. He had gold. He had the Golden Company. He had youth, which is a kind of coin that spends itself without asking. 𝒂𝒆 read it twice and then a third time, and when he looked up his face was a map of a place no one would ever visit for pleasure. "If it is true," he said, "we have another war to fight before we can fight any war at all." "If he is what they say he is," Arianne said, and there was no derision in the if, only the exact balancing of a woman who has learned not to drop anything. "He is your nephew, my queen." "If he is what they say," Dany said, "he is my brother for all that." She felt the old emptiness open in her, the space the dragons had left, the space Viserys had gouged in her with every hungry day he had given her, and she closed it with her will. "We will go and see, after we show the marchers how a road is taken." They took it in 3 days. That is a short time for such a piece of land, and men will tell the story later as if it were easier than it was. It was not. They bled for water. They cracked teeth on acorns. Twice the enemy lit scrub behind them and sent smoke rolling forward like an army, and twice Grey Worm set the ranks to work as calmly as if on parade, beating at flames with wet cloaks, carrying embers on shields to places where the rock would feed them poorly. On the second night, while stars hung so clear they seemed an inventory the gods had forgotten to collect, a small band of Qartheen with mouths like bruises crept into the outer ring of fires and tried to put knives into throats. They found instead a circle of men who had learned to sleep in shifts and to wrap their wrists in their cloaks so that a tug would wake them. 3 Qartheen died softly, and the 4th swallowed something and died quieter still. At the 3rd bend of the 3rd day, the Boneway loosened its teeth and spat them out onto a wider land where wind could gather itself. There the Marcher men broke in earnest. It was not the Unsullied who did it finally, though they held as always. It was a wedge of Dornish spears under a banner showing a falling star, purple on silver. They drove as if the pass itself had taught them to hate men with shields. They drove so hard that the enemy's back ranks turned without orders and ran. "Danes," 𝒂𝒆 said, his mouth soft with something like respect. "There have always been Danes who knew what to do with an edge." The enemy threw down their pikes and their pride and scattered over a shoulder of land studded with pinyon. Dany let them go. She had a letter to answer and a sea to find and a boy to see whose name was a weight in every man's mouth. She rode forward until she could look on the country rolling away toward the Stormlands, and the wind coming up from there smelled of rain even though the sky was clear. The trees were different here, broader, greedier. The birds' cries sounded like home if you had been born to such cries. She was not, but she understood the ache. At dusk, in a camp between old stones and new men, she called her captains and her friends and those who were both. "We go to Griffin's Roost," she said, and Barristan's head came up because the name had been taken from his own remembering. "We go at a pace that keeps men alive. We go with enough banners to be seen and enough scouts to be wise. If we find a boy there whose name is Aegon, I will look him in the face and we will see whether the world means to be kind to either of us." "And if he is kind?" Dario asked, half a jest, half a warning. "Then I will be kind in turn," Dany said. "If he is not, I will be what I must." They broke camp under a moon that had grown thin and sharp. Missandei rode at Dany's left and watched her like a star watches a ship. Grey Worm at her right, a blue stone in a riverbed. Barristan moved ahead to speak to scouts and back again to speak to her, and every time he returned there was a line a little deeper at the corner of his eye. Arianne slipped among the columns on a grey mare that danced when asked and stood still without. She looked pleased in battle the way some women look pleased in mirrors, and Dany, watching, thought, "I could like her. That is as dangerous as a sword." They met their first Stormlord at a crossroads marked by a wooden post that had lost 2 of its arms. He came into sight with a rump of men behind him, all mail and flannel and stubborn chins. His banner showed a tower or a tree or a thing a child had once drawn and a man had later called a castle. He was not old, but older than he thought himself, and when he drew rein and set a hand to his thigh to ease some ache, his men pretended not to see. "You are far from your deserts." He made it an accusation. "I am nearer to my house," Dany said. "Which house is that?" He watched her with a marcher's eyes, wary of tricks and of charm. "The one my father built and lost," Dany said. "The one I mean to rebuild. Will you stand in the door with a pike? Or will you open it and keep your pride?" He glanced over her shoulder, not at Barristan or at the Unsullied, but at Arianne Martell, who sat her gray mare with a sand snake on either side and her hair like loose dark netting. He did not trust Dornishmen. He trusted their spears and their treachery because both had been reliable for longer than he had been alive. He chewed that knowledge like old meat. "The boy," he said. "They say he has your hair, though your hair is not yours for as long as his might be his. They say he has Rhaegar's eyes. They say he took a castle men sing of. They say many things," Dany said. "My men do not sing. They close one door at a time." "You are softer than I expected," the Storm Lord said, and smiled a little to see if she would bleed. Dany kept her face as a quiet room. "No," she said. "You are a poorer judge than you expected." He laughed, then, honest laughter, short and begrudging. "Go on, then. The road forks yonder. If you hold west, you will find a ford with stones that look like a bridge, and old women who will curse you because their grandmothers taught them to. If you hold east, you will meet men who have already decided whom they serve and are waiting to tell you with steel. I am tired of deciding. I will wait here and see who wins, and then I will tell my sons I was wise." "Tell them you were careful," Barristan said. "Wisdom is when you pay for something and know the price." They went east. The land tilted and rose. The air grew damp. Griffins have always fancied cliffs, and men who love them learned to love narrow roads with empty sky on one side and the memory of their own mothers on the other. They made camp in a hollow beneath a shoulder of rock and woke to find mist in their blankets and their breath showing. Dany walked through the rows of sleeping men, touching shoulders with 2 fingers, thinking, "I am learning how to walk among an army without a dragon." The thought was a kind of pain. She did not spit it out. 2 days later, with the sea grumbling to their right and the smell of storm in the wind, they saw the roost. It rose out of a red-brown shoulder of land like a bird that had forgotten how to fly and had become a stone to compensate. A banner snapped above it, black upon blue. Men moved on its walls in a new, taut way, not like long holders but like men who have made a place into a promise with the sharp end of a spear. They did not send a herald. It is sometimes better to arrive first with eyes than with trumpets. Barristan took a dozen riders and went forward under a scrap of white. Dany watched from the rise, a little prickle in her palms that meant her blood was remembering something. A party came out from the gate. No hesitation, no confusion, a precise answer. They met halfway across the slope. There was a moment that hung like a step a dancer has not taken yet. Then one of the riders with the black-on-blue banner moved forward. Dany could not see his face at that distance. She could see how he sat a horse. Not stiff, not showy. A natural ease that comes to men who have been taught by the right hands. Barristan dismounted first. That was courtesy and also test. The boy dismounted a heartbeat later. That was pride being bridled in the old way. They walked together the last 10 paces. Barristan stood very straight. The boy stood straighter. They spoke, too far for words to come cleanly. Dany watched their mouths and told herself fairy tales about the shapes. When they parted, Barristan lifted a hand just a little. It was nothing to an enemy. It was everything to her. She rode down the slope at a canter, Missandei and Grey Worm and Arianne flowing beside her, the sand snakes trailing like knives forgotten in lace. Up close the boy was younger and older both. He had Rhaegar's mouth, if her memory of songs could be trusted, and some stranger's eyes that had looked at maps and at the insides of ships and had learned to stand still when men were shouting. His cloak was plain and his sword well kept. He bowed to her in a way no one had taught him and everyone had. "Your Grace," he said, "I am called Aegon." He did not add anything to it. He did not say who called him that or how or why. He said it as a man names a road he has been walking all his life. Dany dismounted. The ground was soft with the last few days' rain and with the breath of the sea. She came the last few steps not as a queen walking to her throne but as a woman walking to a door. "I am Daenerys," she said. "The world will name me what it wants." He looked into her face for a long moment as if to find in it the right word. "Aunt," he said at last, and did not blink. A gull cried once overhead, the old hinge sound of it like a broken little song. Men on the walls shifted, making the small noises that men make when their bodies remind them they are alive. �𝒂𝒉's hand barely touched Daeny's sleeve and then did not. 𒔂𝒂𝒓𝒆 stood between past and present like a bridge hammered out of iron. "Come inside," Aegon said. "My lord Connington will be pleased to feed you bread not baked on a shield." "Bread is bread," Daeny said. "Its warmth is the same." "Warmth is not always the same," Aerion murmured in Dornish, and smiled when Daeny's lip twitched. They went in under the old rough arch, into a hall that smelled of smoke and men's breath and the wet wool stink of soldiers who have been wearing the same thoughts too long. Connington stood on the raised step at the end and bowed with a care that seemed to pain him. And perhaps it did, the old pain of having once chosen wrong and finding yourself alive anyway. He was broad where Barristan was spare, iron where Barristan was steel. They had been boys together. Now they were two old swords laid side by side. You could see what they had cut and what had cut them back. "We have few cups," he said, "but we will not ask you to share." "We have not come to take your cups," Daeny said. "We have come to weigh names." Aegon stood with his hands light on the back of a chair, as if he might lift it, as if he might set it down. "There is a city whose red keeps I think about when the rain is loud," he said. "I think about the hands that are in it and the tongues that command them. I think about my sister I never had. I think about the man who sat in my father's place. I think about my aunt who is here instead of there. These are the thoughts I have when the world is too much to measure." "You speak too prettily for a boy," Daario said, and Aerion gave him a glance like a finger to his lips, and he swallowed the rest of his wit. "Words are swords where I learned to live," Aegon said with something that might have been humor and might have been merely the courage to confess a wound no one had made for him. "We do our cutting at table first." Connington's jaw worked. "We will cut no throats in this hall," he said. "We have bled enough to make men thin. We will speak. We will see whether the gods meant to break us apart or to set us on the same grindstone." Daeny stood with her palms on wood that had known more fists than fingers. The light in the hall was winter sour even in spring. It found the white in Barristan's hair and made it into a crown a man might wear if he were tired of iron. It found the gold in Aerion's net and lit it like fire caught in a trap. It found Aegon's hand where it rested on the chair, and she saw the marks of rope on the fingers. A boy raised at sea has a sailor's scars. "I lost my dragons," she said without flinching. "I burned the thing that had them, and I will not take that back with any word a man can teach me. I have an army and no sorcery. I have a name. I have lived long enough to know both are smaller than men pretend. I will not be a lie you tell the world to get a better share of its bread. If you are truth, show me. If you are a lie, I will end you kindly." Aegon's mouth made a small, surprised shape, and then he smiled, and in the smile she saw a shade of rigor. Only the idea of him, which is all she had ever had. "Aunt," he said, the word easier the second time. "Let us find out together." Outside, the sea spoke to the cliffs about weight and balance and the folly of wings. Inside, men old and young squared their shoulders to hear a future arrive like a stranger at dusk. In Dorne, at the water gardens, children splashed in shallow pools, and the prince who had taught himself to live with pain sat in a chair carved with limes and listened to a wind from the east that did not bring any smell to help him. In Qarth, above the long-dead garden, the tower that had gone wrong stood black against a starless patch of sky and learned how to be empty. In King's Landing, a boy king studied his sums while his mother whispered his name as if she could make it into armor. In the far north, beyond where any of them had learned to think, the wind found its hands under everything and lifted, and the world breathed, and the breath it took was cold.